My name is Avery, and I am 34 years old, and I live in the heart of Chicago, Illinois, where the wind coming off Lake Michigan can cut through your coat like a knife in the middle of January. And I have spent most of my adult life working as a registered nurse at one of the busiest hospitals in the city, which means I have seen just about everything a human being can go through, but nothing prepared me for the pain of being betrayed by the two people I trusted most in this world, and for a long time, I was a woman who believed in the goodness of people, and I believed that if you worked hard and treated others with kindness, that the universe would take care of you. And I worked the night shift for 7 years straight, which is a grueling schedule that turns your world upside down, because you are awake when everyone else is sleeping, and you are trying to sleep when the rest of the world is loud and bright. And I did it all for my fiancé, whose name was Mark, because we were trying to save up for a house and a wedding and a future together. And Mark was a man who seemed to appreciate every sacrifice I made, and he was handsome and funny, and he always had a warm meal waiting for me when I got home at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we had a best friend named Sarah, who had been in my life since we were both 10 years old. And Sarah was the kind of woman who lit up a room when she walked into it, but she was also someone who always needed to be the center of attention, and I never minded that because I was happy to be the steady one in the background, and I loved her like a sister. And I trusted her with every secret I had, including the keys to our apartment, because she lived nearby and would often drop off groceries or check on our cat while I was at the hospital. And for 3 years, I lived in a state of exhausted bliss, thinking I had the perfect life until the morning everything shattered into a million pieces, and I had finished a particularly brutal shift where we had lost a patient I had grown close to, and I was feeling raw and vulnerable, and I just wanted to be held by Mark. So I stopped at the bakery to get his favorite cinnamon rolls, and I walked into our apartment quietly so I would not wake him up if he was still in bed, and the first thing I noticed was Sarah's designer shoes by the door, and I thought it was strange for her to be there so early, but I assumed she had just dropped by to leave something for us. But as I walked toward the bedroom, I heard voices, and I heard laughter, and I heard sounds that no woman should ever hear coming from her own bedroom when she is not the one inside it. And I pushed the door open, and my entire reality folded in on itself, because there was my fiancé and my best friend in the bed that I had paid for with my overtime hours, and the look on their faces was not one of immediate regret, but one of shock, and then a strange kind of annoyance from Sarah, as if I was the one who had done something wrong by coming home early. And Mark started babbling excuses about how he was lonely because I was always at work, and Sarah started saying that it just happened, and that they did not mean to hurt me. But the truth was that they had been having an affair for over a year right under my nose, while I was literally saving lives and cleaning up blood and vomit to pay our bills. And I did not scream, and I did not cry in front of them because something inside of me went cold and hard like the ice on the Chicago River. And I told them both to get out, and I ended the engagement that day, but the damage was done because I lost my partner and my best friend and my sense of safety all at once, and the years that followed were a blur of depression and anger as I watched from a distance through mutual friends, as Sarah moved on with her life without a single scratch on her reputation. And she eventually met a man named Ethan, who was a very successful and wealthy corporate lawyer. And they got married in a lavish ceremony that looked like something out of a magazine, and she posted pictures of her perfect life in her perfect mansion in the suburbs, and she looked like a saint who had never done a wrong thing in her life, while I was still struggling to feel like a whole person again. And I would see her social media posts where she talked about loyalty and love, and it made me feel a level of rage that I did not know was possible for a human being to contain. And I realized that Sarah did not just take my man, she took my peace, and she never faced a single consequence for what she did to me, and that was when the seed of revenge began to grow in my mind, and I knew I could not just slash her tires or tell people what she did, because she was a master of manipulation, and she would just make me look like the crazy ex-friend who was bitter and jealous. And I needed to do something that would hit her where it hurt the most, which was her image and her security. And I began to study Ethan from afar, not because I liked him, but because he was the foundation of the life she had built. And I discovered that Ethan was a man of routine, and he spent every Tuesday and Thursday evening at a specific high-end athletic club in the city. And he was known for being a bit of a workaholic who felt neglected by a wife who spent all his money but did not give him much attention. And I knew that dynamic because I had lived the opposite of it, and I started going to that same athletic club. And I made sure I was in the best shape of my life, and I changed my hair and my style, so looked like the sophisticated woman a man like Ethan would notice, and I made sure our paths crossed in a way that seemed entirely accidental. And the first time we spoke was in the juice bar after a workout, and I was reading a book on medical ethics, which I knew would appeal to his intellectual side. And he commented on it, and I gave him a smile that was just friendly enough to be inviting but mysterious enough to make him wonder. And we started talking, and I found out that he was indeed a very lonely man who felt like a walking checkbook for his wife, and he did not know who I was because Sarah had scrubbed me from her history, and told him I was just an old acquaintance who moved away, and I saw my opening and I took it. And over the next several months, I became Ethan's confidant, and I listened to him talk about his stresses and his dreams. And I played the role of the perfect supportive woman who understood what it was like to work hard and be unappreciated, and I felt a twinge of guilt because Ethan was not actually a bad guy. But then I would remember Sarah's face in my bed, and the guilt would vanish, and I began an affair with Ethan. And I made sure it was intense and emotional so he would feel like he found his soulmate. And I was careful never to leave a trace that Sarah could find yet. But I was building a mountain of evidence that I could use when the time was right, and I started taking photos of us together and keeping logs of our meetings, and I even had him buy me gifts that were identical to things he bought for her just so I could see the irony of it. And as the affair grew deeper, I found myself facing hurdles because I actually started to care about the man, and that made the revenge feel complicated. And there was a moment where I almost told him the truth because I did not want to be the villain in his story. But then I saw a post from Sarah where she was wearing the same necklace Ethan had given me, and she wrote a caption about how her husband was her rock and how she was the luckiest woman alive to have such a faithful and devoted man. And that post was the final push I needed because it showed me she was still a liar who built her happiness on a foundation of deceit. And I decided to escalate things. And I convinced Ethan that we should have a weekend away together at a boutique hotel in the city, while Sarah was supposed to be at a spa retreat with her friends. And I knew Sarah's schedule because I had been tracking her for months, and I knew that her spa retreat was actually a cover for her to go on a shopping trip with her mother. And I also knew that she would be coming home early because her mother always got bored and complained. And I made sure that Ethan and I were in a very public place near their home on the afternoon she was expected back. And we were sitting in a small cafe with big windows. And I saw her car pull into the driveway of the house across the street. And I leaned in and kissed Ethan with everything I had, and I saw her stop in her tracks as she looked through the window of the cafe, and our eyes met for a split second, and the look of pure horror on her face was better than any drug I had ever administered in the hospital. And she came storming into the cafe screaming and making a scene, and Ethan was terrified and confused, and he tried to explain, but she was hysterical, and she pointed at me and called me a homewrecker and a snake. And that was when I stood up calmly, and I looked her dead in the eye, and I said, "Hello, Sarah, do you remember me?" And the silence that followed was deafening as the color drained from her face, and she realized that this was not just a random affair, but a targeted strike. And I looked at Ethan, and I told him exactly who I was, and I told him exactly what his wife had done to me years ago, and I showed him the messages I had saved from her back then, and I showed him the photos of her in my bed that I had kept as a reminder of why I could never trust anyone again. And Ethan looked at Sarah, and then he looked at me, and he saw the woman he had been cheating with was the victim of the woman he had married, and the situation became a nightmare for everyone involved, because Sarah started attacking me physically, and the police had to be called, and the scene was captured on the phones of at least a dozen people in the cafe, and it went viral in our social circles within hours, and I thought that would be the end of it, and I thought I would feel a sense of total victory. But as I sat in my car watching the police talk to them, I felt a strange hollow sensation in my chest, because I had become the thing I hated, and I had used another person to get my way. And for a few weeks it felt like I had failed because Sarah managed to spin the story to some people as me being an obsessive stalker who manipulated her husband, and Ethan was so hurt and angry at both of us that he moved out and filed for divorce. But he also blocked my number and refused to speak to me ever again, and I felt like I had lost everything all over again. Because I was alone and my reputation was being dragged through the mud by Sarah's remaining friends, and I spent many nights crying in my apartment wondering if it was all worth it, and if I was just as bad as she was. And I started to think that my revenge had backfired, and that she would somehow come out on top again, because she was already dating someone else and acting like a victim of a crazy woman. And I reached my lowest point when I was suspended from my job because the viral video showed me a physical altercation, and the hospital board had to investigate if I was fit to be a nurse. And I sat in my dark living room in Chicago listening to the sirens outside. And I felt like I had destroyed my own life just to get a moment of spite against a woman who did not even care about me. And I realized that if I wanted to truly win, I had to finish what I started in a way that she could not manipulate. And I had to stop playing her game and start playing mine, and I spent the next month gathering every bit of information I had on her financial dealings, because I knew Sarah had been skimming money from Ethan's business accounts for years to fund her lifestyle. And I had discovered this while I was with Ethan because he had complained about missing funds that he could not account for. And I had access to his laptop during our secret weekends. And I had taken screenshots of the discrepancies that pointed directly to Sarah's personal offshore account that she thought no one knew about. Decided to take this information not to the police, but to Ethan's law firm and his business partners. And I knew that if she lost her money and her status, she would have nothing left. And I went to the law firm on a Monday morning, dressed in my best professional suit. And I asked to speak with the senior partner, who was a friend of Ethan's. And I handed him a folder full of evidence that proved Sarah had been embezzling from the firm through Ethan's accounts. And the look on the partner's face was one of absolute shock, and he thanked me for bringing it to him, and he told me that they had been looking for a leak for a long time. And I felt a sense of relief that I was finally doing something that was not just about my own pain, but about justice for a man who had also been betrayed by her. And the fallout was immediate and devastating for Sarah, because she was not just facing a divorce anymore, but she was facing federal charges for embezzlement and fraud, and her bank accounts were frozen, and her designer clothes were seized, and her perfect mansion was put up for sale to pay back the stolen money. And she tried to call me, and she tried to beg me to help her. But I did not answer the phone, and I watched from the sidelines as she lost every single thing she had ever valued. And she had to move into a tiny studio apartment on the south side of the city, and she took a job working in a fast food restaurant just to make ends meet. And the woman who had once looked down on me from her pedestal was now the one struggling to survive, and I finally felt the weight lift off my shoulders. But the revenge had one last consequence that I did not expect, because as I was rebuilding my own life and getting my job back at the hospital, I received a letter in the mail, and it was from Ethan, and I expected it to be a letter of hate or a legal threat. But when I opened it, I found a simple note that said thank you for showing me the truth, even if the way you did it was painful. And I realized that he was not angry at me anymore, and he had moved on to a better life as well. And I went back to my night shifts at the hospital, and I found a new sense of purpose in my work, and I stopped looking at social media, and I stopped caring about what people thought of me, and I became a better nurse, because I understood the depths of human suffering and the complexity of the human heart. And I met a man named James who was a doctor at the hospital, and he was kind and honest, and we started a real relationship built on trust and transparency. And I never told him the full story of my revenge, but I told him that I had learned the hard way that loyalty is the most important thing in the world. And one day I was walking down a street in Chicago, and I saw a woman who looked familiar, and it was Sarah, and she looked tired and old, and she was carrying a heavy bag of groceries. And she did not see me, but I saw her, and I felt no anger, and I felt no joy, and I just felt a sense of peace, because the debt had been paid in full, and I kept walking toward my own life, which was finally full of light. And as I walked, I realized that the best revenge was not just taking away her happiness, but finding my own and making sure it was real this time. And I thought about the night shifts I used to work, and how I used to be afraid of the dark. But now I know that the dark is just where you find the strength to see the light. And I am Avery, and I am 34 years old, and I am a survivor of betrayal and a creator of my own destiny, and I do not have a single regret for what I did, because it led me to the woman I am today, and that woman is someone I finally respect and love. And as the Chicago wind blew around me, I wrapped my coat tighter and smiled, because for the first time in a decade, I was not looking back at the past, but I was looking forward to a future that belonged only to me, and no one could ever take that away from me again. And I realized that the story of my life was not defined by what Sarah did to me, but by what I did for myself, and the lessons I learned about the power of standing up for your own worth, even when the world tries to break you down. And I know that some people might think I am a bad person for what I did to Ethan and Sarah. But they did not feel the coldness of that bedroom that morning, and they did not feel the years of being treated like I was nothing. And I believe that sometimes you have to burn down the old world to build a new one, and that is exactly what I did. And I am finally free, and the air in Chicago never tasted so sweet, and the city lights never looked so bright, and I am finally home within myself. And that is the greatest revenge of all because she is still trapped in her own lies, and I am living in the truth every single day. And that is a victory that no amount of money or status could ever buy, and I am proud of the person I have become through the fire, and the ice, and the pain, and the triumph of my own heart.